On today's Jerusalem Dateline, Israel keeps the pressure on Hamas with military operations in the north and south of Gaza. Members of the student body at the University of Michigan are pressured to vote on a controversial anti-Israel resolution. Plus, are U.S.-imposed restrictions affecting morale in the IDF and Israel's ability to defend itself? And one man's faith fuels his will to survive in the tunnels under Gaza as a Hamas hostage. All this and more coming up on this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Using rape, sexual violence as a weapon of war. That's the charge Israel leveled against Hamas at the United Nations on Monday. Israel's ambassador to the UN also called out the UN for remaining silent about these atrocities. Here's that story and the latest on the fighting in Gaza. The IDF says its fight against Hamas is expanding.
As we expand our operation in Gaza, we remain committed to our goals: secure the release of our hostages and dismantle Hamas.
While condemning Hamas's strategy of using Gazans as human shields, the IDF says its goal is to help civilians get out of harm's way.
We are giving precise instructions to Gazan residents near Hamas centers of gravity, urging them to temporarily move away from the danger that Hamas puts them in.
The IDF continues to destroy hundreds of Hamas tunnels. The Wall Street Journal reports Israel is considering flooding the underground network with seawater, pumped from the Mediterranean to drive Hamas fighters out into the open. At the UN on Monday, the Israeli embassy sponsored a special session calling for condemnation of Hamas for using sexual violence against Israeli women on October 7th. Israeli Ambassador Gilad Erdan said there has been deafening silence from the UN, which waited too long, 8 weeks, to condemn the tactics.
We know this from eyewitnesses. We know this from combat paramedics. We would know this from some victims if more had been allowed to live. Maybe then one would be standing beside me right here to state something that should not need to be stated. Rape should never be used as an act of war.
Keynote speaker Sheryl Sandberg, the former COO of Facebook, condemned the use of sexual violence. Hamas said the accusations were unfounded lies to demonize Palestinian resistance.
The world has to decide who to believe. Do we believe the Hamas spokesperson who said that rape is forbidden, therefore it couldn't have possibly happened on October 7th? Or do we believe the women whose bodies tell us how they spent the last minutes of their lives? Who are we going to believe?
About a dozen Israeli women are still held hostage by Hamas. One U.S. official said the terror group might be unwilling to release them because they might talk about abuse they've experienced in captivity. The University of Michigan has canceled a controversial student vote on the conflict between Hamas and Israel. Jewish groups and Israel supporters contend it was an anti-Israel resolution that labeled the country a genocidal, apartheid state. Gary Lane has details.
Resolution AR 1325 asks students at the Ann Arbor campus to approve university accountability in the face of genocide. The university stopped the vote late last week after the pro-Palestinian Tahrir Coalition sent an email to the entire student body urging approval of the resolution. Administration officials called that a violation of university rules and tainted the voting process. If students had voted and approved the anti-Israel resolution, it may have set a precedent for similar votes at other colleges and universities. The son of a Hamas founder, Mossab Hassan Youssef, addressed the students before voting began, saying he could not believe activists asked students to make the choice.
A mob that forced such a respectful educational institution to vote on such a thing. It's absurd.
The resolution refers to Palestine as a victim of settler colonialism, and it calls on the University of Michigan to recognize the millions of people undergoing genocide in Gaza. The resolution also calls for the University of Michigan to revisit its decision against forming a committee to, quote, investigate the ethics of its investments in apartheid regimes. Protesters made similar demands at the height of the BDS, or Boycott, Sanctions and Divestment movement against Israel. Yusuf calls the apartheid allegation idiotic.
We have 1.6 million Arabs in the state of Israel. That's a huge percentage. They have representatives in the parliament, the Israeli Knesset. Arabic, the language Arabic, is an official language in the state of Israel.
And Yusuf contends Hamas, not Israel, is committing genocide. He reminded the audience of the October 7th terror attacks and that the Hamas charter advocates the destruction of the state of Israel.
It all begins with killing Jews. This is what motivates them. But to go and ethnically cleanse more than 20 communities, killing everything in your way, and everything is documented. This is what Israel suffered on October 7th. And this cannot be compared to the war victims in Gaza.
The Geneva Convention describes genocide as a crime committed with the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. One aspect of genocide is the forcible transference of children from one group to another. The Hamas kidnapping of Jewish children and holding them as hostages fits the genocide definition. Yusuf urges students to engage in dialogue and conversation to discover the truth about Hamas and its goals.
Educational institutions, we've been invaded by Hamas ideology, by the name of Palestine and by the name of revolution. Who cares? Anti-Semitism is Nazism, and it's rejected. It should be rejected on this campus, should be rejected everywhere in the United States.
Gary Lane, CBN News.
Up next, who will rule Gaza after this war is over? One Israeli legal expert explains more when we come back. Jeff Balaban is the Senior Counsel for International and Governmental Affairs with the American Center for Law and Justice. Here's the conversation he had recently with CBN President Gordon Robertson about the latest developments in Israel's war with Hamas.
So tell us about the Biden administration here. They're talking about a revitalized Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza, as well as governing a potential Palestinian state. What's the implications for Israel in that scenario?
Thanks, Gordon. I'll just say this. God forbid, even before the horror of October 7th, there was extremely broad consensus in Israel that a so-called two-state solution is an absurdity. There's no evidence that any sector of Palestinian society disavowed that atrocity or the goal of total genocide. And since then, since October 7th, it's become clear that the entire Palestinian population in Gaza and in Judea-Samaria, what the world likes to call the West Bank, embraced, even celebrated October 7th. Those very few voices in polls now who say that they don't support it don't appear to not support it because they're opposed to genocide, but for strategic or tactical reasons. And Gaza is far less of a threat than handing control of Judea and Samaria to these genocidal terrorists. This is a dead-on-arrival concept.
There's some talk of Jordan taking over the West Bank. Is that serious talk, or is that just speculation?
Well, I haven't heard that here, Gordon, but you know, the whole creation of Transjordan, which then became Jordan, let's go do a little quick history. You know, about 80% of what was known as the Jewish national home, the mandate for Palestine, was given to create this Arab nation, which was supposed to be the safety valve. That was supposed to take care of this problem. And of course, they ousted all of their Jews. Israel didn't oust its Arabs, and Israelis, Arab citizens, very much contribute and are part of the culture. But it's this leftover group that now is called Palestinians. It wasn't called Palestinians then, but since the 1960s called Palestinians. You know, this is a terrible, cynical game of blackmail. The reality is that Jordan keeps on denying their responsibility. They should have responsibility. Instead of talking about the East Bank of the Jordan, and they refer to, or the West Bank rather, we should talk about the East Bank, which was the Jews' land. They should be taking responsibility. Israel doesn't feel, apparently, that they can push that internationally. I think they should.
Well, the administration, some Democrat senators are now talking about strings on military aid to Israel. How will this affect Israel's ability to destroy Hamas?
Well, that is definitely political blackmail. I mean, you see that the Secretary of State has been here multiple times. My sources are telling me that he's on the phone basically hourly, and it's a threat. The threat is Israel needs bunker buster bombs. Israel needs precision-guided weapons. Otherwise, we know what happens. More collateral damage, more dead Gazans, more soldier deaths, more IDF deaths. It's such a cynical ploy. Some suggest it's part of a ploy to actually oust the Prime Minister Netanyahu, toward whom Biden and the Democrats have expressed tremendous past hostility. Secretary of State Blinken has been doing this nonstop, and while Israel is extremely grateful for the support they are getting in public, in private, they're deeply, deeply concerned about the limitations. It will make it much more difficult to bring peace, much more difficult to achieve their goals. And these goals are necessary because it's Hamas, but also well beyond Hamas. We know that many of those who came over on October 7th were not Hamas. Many of those were so-called, quote, innocent civilians, unquote. Many of those were associated with the numerous other genocidal jihadi groups. And so this is a very serious situation that Israel knows threatens its very existence. What the Secretary of State, what the Biden administration is doing is, on the one hand, being somewhat helpful publicly, but privately making it very difficult for Israel to wage this war successfully.
Well, the UN has finally weighed in. It took them a long time to finally say that what happened on October 7th was horrific, and that it was specifically violence directed at women, that rape was used as a weapon of war. They're finally waking up to it, and just recently the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court has joined in saying that there were serious violations of international law. Do you expect Hamas to actually be charged with war crimes?
That's a great question. I don't know if Hamas will be charged with war crimes. What I do expect is another shoe to drop. The UN was essentially shamed into this by public calls and public shows that the massive, horrific attacks, the violations, which I don't even want to repeat because they're so ugly and so beyond barbaric. And it was just, they confronted the UN and said, how dare you not speak about this? I actually believe the reverse, Gordon. I believe that the UN, having been forced to acknowledge the evil of October 7th, will actually redouble its efforts to somehow blame Israel and claim that Israel is the worst player, because that's what they do. And let's not forget, we know that UNRWA employees, the UN organization that is supposed to take care of these refugees, sends billions of dollars and is raising them to be jihadis. He's raising them to want genocide. But we see more than that, that they seem to be providing support not only their personnel, but also their institutions where their weapons are being hidden. So the UN itself really needs to be held to account for this by the American public, first and foremost, because America has a big influence on the UN when it wants to, because America provides a lot of the funding.
Well, we stopped the funding under the Trump administration. Biden put it back in, and the evidence seems to be quite clear that UNRWA was having Hamas terrorists on their payroll. Which is one of those you've got to be kidding me moments where how can you ever do that? Let's talk about the Shema. The IDF is now playing the Shema over loudspeakers in Gaza and trying to encourage the remaining hostages. Why is this prayer so crucial?
Thanks, Gordon, for asking that question. I don't know if this is an official IDF policy or just soldiers did this on their own, but they did set up loudspeakers and started blasting, and they said they wanted to do it so that the hostages might hear them, because they don't know where the hostages are held. They're underground, they're in buildings. Maybe they'll hear them blasting it. And what I found so moving, Gordon, was that they didn't play the Israeli national anthem, Hatikva. These soldiers, and again, I don't know if it came down from above or they just did it on their own, they started playing the Shema prayer. Gordon, every morning, religious Jews, observant Jews say Shema. Every evening we say Shema. So we begin our day with and end our day with. The last thing we say at night, the first thing we teach our children. The rabbis teach us, and by the way, this is also, the Shema prayer is what Jews hope to have on their lips as they die. The rabbis teach us that this is what the tribes, Jacob's sons, said to him on his deathbed as he's dying, when he gives them their blessings and he tells them sort of what their future is going to be. They testify to him and say, no, Father, because remember, Jacob's name is Israel. So hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. This is the testimony that the Jewish people say to the world. And you know, between Jacob, our father, and us, I think about this often, Gordon. There are only 140 or 150 generations. If you think about it, only 140 or 150 parents who passed this message on to their children. And now you see that this is what's being awoken. This is what October 7th has awoken in the Israeli populace. We see Israeli soldiers are wearing tzitzit, they're wearing the four fringes, even if they say they're secular. They're wearing it as they go to war, besides their bulletproof vests. Israel has always struggled between its Jewish identity and its secular democratic identity. Now you see this in the streets, in the army. They're becoming more and more aware that all of these attacks are because we're Jews. Jews are treated differently, and they're responding by being ever more Jewish. It was so amazing that that's what they chose to broadcast in Gaza. Hopefully, some of those hostages were able to hear it. Hopefully it gave them hope to know that the children of Israel are fighting a war for them.
Well, I hope it also encourages everyone in Israel to stand together as one to resist this absolute evil. There aren't words to describe what happened on October 7th, other than the face of evil was revealed for the entire world to see. And we stand as one with you, with Israel, to say, yes, no more. Hamas should not exist anymore. Please be encouraged, no matter what you're hearing from the UN, from the International Criminal Court, or even from our own government here in America, we stand with you. Hamas has to go. Stand strong. We need to eliminate this evil. Jeff, thanks for joining with us, and thanks for all that you're doing.
Coming up, the United States urging Israel to show restraint in Gaza to save civilian lives. Why critics say Washington's demands could undermine Israel's strategy to destroy Hamas. CBN war correspondent Chuck Holton stopped by our studio to give his insights on the restrictions requested by the Biden administration affecting Israel's combat strategy in Gaza. Take a look. So Blinken came over. He's got all restrictions. They kind of, keep civilians out of harm's way, put them in certain areas. It seems like Israel was doing a lot of this anyway. But how unprecedented is this that all these restrictions would be put on Israel's army?
Well, I think it shows two things. There's number one, it shows the level of dependency that Israel has on the United States, or at least the level of dependency the United States believes that Israel has. Secondly, it sends a message to Hamas that we are on their side from the United States, that the Biden administration is fighting for Hamas. And that is a huge morale win for the troops that are in the field fighting for Hamas right now, but it's also a morale killer for the Israelis. And that is really putting their scale and putting their thumb on the scale for the Palestinians. And that is not a good thing in this conflict.
You've covered wars all over the world. How unprecedented is this that Israel would be forced to kind of do this?
It was very common for the United States to come into a conflict in what they call an advise and assist role. And I've seen them do it in Afghanistan, I've seen them do it in Iraq, I've seen them do it in Ukraine even. But that advise and assist role is just there to, offer our advice and then give you assistance. This goes a whole different level. This is crossing a line because they're not saying, we're just here to offer our advice. They're saying, here are our conditions. You will do this and this and this. And again, this actually puts their thumb on the scale to stack the deck in favor of the Palestinians.
Does this put IDF soldiers at risk?
Of course it does. And it's going to probably not only extend the conflict, but what we're seeing now is that the IDF is having to step up its operational tempo to try to get as much done as they can before the international pressure becomes too great. And that means they're going to have to take shortcuts. They're not going to be able to be as methodical and careful as they need to be to keep from getting IDF troops killed. So without a doubt, more IDF troops will die because of this, and likely more Palestinian people will die because they're going to have to try to push this as fast as possible. The other thing that the IDF needs to do is they need to very tightly define what victory means, because since they have so much pressure coming from the United States, they're goal of, quote, wiping out Hamas. Well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean killing all the people who side with Hamas? That is apparently 75% of people in Gaza. That would, you can't do that. They're not going to be able to kill their way out of this. And so they need to be very clear about defining what victory means, and in so doing can maybe do an end run around the United States.
Any final thoughts?
I think that they have this trump card in order to be able to say, we still have a couple 100,000 internally displaced people in our country who are not going to go back to their homes. They will refuse until we do something to definitely get rid of the threat from Hamas and Hezbollah in the north, for that matter. Mm-hmm. And so if they can put that down on the table in front of Anthony Blinken and say, we hear what you're saying, but we have to listen to our own people, and they're going to have to play that card.
Yeah. All right, Chuck Holton, thanks.
Sure.
Still ahead, he thought he was as good as dead. How one man found the strength to survive in hellish conditions. On October 7th, terrorists murdered his elderly employer right in front of him and then took him captive. Jimmy Pacheco spent more than 50 days as a prisoner of Hamas, and now he tells his story of survival and his gratitude to God for his freedom.
On October 7th, the day Hamas terrorists began their attacks along the Gaza border, Jimmy Pacheco was taken hostage.
When I was taken out of the house, I didn't expect them to spare me because I witnessed my employer being killed mercilessly.
Jimmy lived in a kibbutz where he was a caregiver to an elderly man who was immediately killed by Hamas. In an exclusive interview, Jimmy talked about his harrowing experience.
I heard gunfire from another house, and I sent a message to my wife back in the Philippines to take care of our children. Hamas asked me if I am a soldier. They set a rifle on automatic and fired beside my ear until the ammo ran out. After that, I heard a buzzing sound in my ears. When our supplies were scarce, they only gave us one pita bread for the whole day. But I didn't eat it in one sitting. I just got a pinch whenever I felt hungry. As time passed, the water supply became salty. I worried because I had a history of kidney illness. When I needed to defecate, they gave me a piece of toilet paper. I didn't use it. I hid it in my pocket so I could eat it. For me, it was food. I would take the toilet paper and dab it on the moist walls. We were about 40 meters below the ground, so it was cold and there was condensation on the walls. When the paper got wet enough, I ate it. It filled my empty stomach as well as quenched my thirst. They also made me clean 7 toilets. I was okay with that because if I did not do it, the smell would get worse. During the first and second weeks, I stayed inside a small prison with a toilet right beside me. I kept thinking and wondering, why would they capture me? It was driving me crazy. Why would they capture me if I didn't do anything to them? I got my strength for my children. I had the strength to eat toilet paper because I needed to survive for my children. I pleaded to God because I was 12 years old when my father died. I prayed, please don't do this to me. Please let me live. Even if I stay here for 10 years, just let me live.
After roughly a month and a half in captivity, Jimmy was included in the first batch of hostages released by Hamas.
They told us we would be leaving the tunnel where we were held captive. That's when I started to cry. When I first saw the sun and came out from the tunnel, I just knelt down and thanked the Lord because I saw the sun again and breathed fresh air. My strength came from the Lord and for my children. Now I am more mature and stronger in many respects. I want to stay here and keep working, even after what they did to me. I want to provide for my family, because I do not want my children to experience the hardships that I experienced when I was a child. And I would like to thank you all for your prayers.
Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. And remember to keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem, safety for the Israeli soldiers and all innocent civilians in Gaza, and the return of all the hostages to their families. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.